Mark adjusted his uniform as the shuttle docked, the soft thrum of the engines fading into the sterile hum of the Asolari station. He'd spent months preparing for his new post here, a crucial joint research base set up after decades of tentative cooperation between Earth and the Asolari Confederation. He felt ready, or at least as ready as anyone could be, stepping into an alien world for the first time. The airlock cycled open, revealing the station's interior. The architecture was smooth and curved, a stark contrast to the angular design of human habitats. Soft blue light emanated from panels along the walls, casting a cool, calming glow. Mark's gaze swept the corridor as he stepped inside, the weight of his assignment finally settling on his shoulders. "Mark Willis." A voice interrupted his thoughts. Turning, Mark saw a short, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a grey streak running through his otherwise dark hair. He wore a loose jumpsuit, the insignia of the joint Human-Asolari mission on his chest. "Yes, that's me," Mark replied, extending his hand. "You must be Commander Allen." "Just call me Ryan," the man said, gripping Mark's hand firmly. "You're the new cultural liaison, right? Good to have you. This place can be a bit overwhelming at first." "I've been told," Mark said with a polite smile. "It's an honor to be here." "Honor's got nothing to do with it," Ryan said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's get you settled." They walked down the hallway together, Ryan pointing out various sections of the station as they went. "That's the main dining hall. Humans and Asolari share the space, though mealtime customs can differ a bit. Over there's the research wing, where the Asolari work their science magic. And this," he gestured toward a wide door, "is the crew lounge. Good place to unwind." Mark nodded, taking mental notes. "What about living quarters?" "Just ahead," Ryan said. "You'll be sharing a hall with the other liaisons and the cultural exchange staff. And before I forget," he stopped, turning to face Mark, "there's one thing you should keep in mind about the Asolari. You'll hear this from others too, but it bears repeating." Mark raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Pairing season," Ryan said, lowering his voice. "It's a delicate time for them. Their instincts get a little, let's say, heightened. During that period, we strongly advise keeping your doors locked, for their sake as much as your own." Mark blinked, trying to process the comment. "Pairing season? Are we talking about—" "Exactly," Ryan cut him off. "Don't overthink it. Just respect their customs, and there won't be any issues." "I'll keep that in mind," Mark said, a bit uncertain. They resumed their walk, and Ryan offered more practical tips about the station. By the time they reached Mark's assigned quarters, he felt marginally more prepared. The room was simple but comfortable, with a workstation, a sleeping alcove, and a small sitting area. The large viewport offered a breathtaking view of the planet below, its surface dotted with shimmering green and gold. "Not bad," Mark said, setting his duffel bag down. "You'll find it cozy enough," Ryan replied. "We keep a pretty informal atmosphere here, but everyone's here to do their job. You'll meet the rest of the crew at dinner tonight. I'll introduce you to a few of the Asolari as well." Mark nodded, his thoughts spinning. He had read extensively about the Asolari before accepting this post. They were an elegant species, humanoid but distinct, with shimmering scales that reflected their emotions in subtle hues. Their culture was complex, a blend of ritual and practicality that fascinated anthropologists and linguists alike. Mark had imagined learning their customs, bridging gaps, building understanding. He hadn't imagined he'd have to worry about something as primal as a pairing season. As Ryan left to handle other duties, Mark sat at his desk and began reviewing the station's orientation materials. The minutes ticked by, and soon it was time for dinner. Mark made his way to the dining hall, where he found Ryan chatting with a tall, silver-scaled Asolari who radiated an aura of calm authority. The alien's eyes, large and dark with faintly golden irises, turned to Mark as he approached. "Ah, Mark, this is Verax," Ryan said. "Verax is one of the Asolari lead coordinators. He's been here since the station's inception." Verax inclined his head in greeting. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mark Willis. I trust your accommodations are satisfactory." "Yes, thank you," Mark said. "I'm looking forward to learning more about your people and working together." "Your enthusiasm is appreciated," Verax replied. "Our collaboration here is a unique opportunity for growth. I hope you find your time on this station rewarding." As they exchanged pleasantries, Mark noticed another Asolari lingering at the far side of the hall, observing the interaction. Her scales were a deep, rich green, and her eyes held a curious sparkle. When she realized he was looking, she quickly turned away, her face flushing a faint pink. Mark couldn't help but smile at the awkward moment. "That's Filka," Ryan said quietly, catching Mark's glance. "She's one of the younger scientists here. Pretty brilliant, from what I've heard. Shy, though." "I see," Mark said, filing the name away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation. Mark met several other human and Asolari crew members, each with their own unique perspective on the station's mission. By the time he returned to his quarters, he felt both energized and overwhelmed by the sheer diversity of experiences and ideas. As he lay on his bed, staring out the viewport, Mark found himself replaying the day's events. He couldn't shake the image of Filka's shy glance, nor the peculiar warning about pairing season. It was clear that life here would be far more complex than he had imagined. But that, he thought, was exactly what he had signed up for. The next morning, Mark made his way toward the station's Common Research Wing, his data slate in hand and his head still swimming with the previous day's introductions. The sleek, seamless hallways curved gently, directing him toward a spacious, high-ceilinged lab filled with an assortment of alien and human equipment. Several Asolari moved about, their flowing garments and shimmering scales reflecting the ambient blue lights. Near one of the central workstations, Filka stood intently studying a holographic projection. The translucent image displayed a complex molecular structure rotating slowly in midair. She reached out with a long, slender finger to highlight a particular segment, her green scales catching the light in shifting hues. Mark cleared his throat as he approached. "Good morning." Filka looked up, her wide golden eyes meeting his. "Good morning, Mark Willis." She hesitated, as though testing out the words, then offered a small, polite bow of her head. "How can I assist you?" "Actually," Mark said, raising his data slate slightly, "I was hoping to get a better understanding of the Asolari's current research focus. I mean, I've read the briefings, but I'd like to hear it straight from someone involved." Filka blinked, her scales shifting to a faint teal. "You are interested in the atmospheric regeneration project, then?" "Exactly," he replied. "From what I've read, it could have significant implications for environmental restoration on Earth." Filka gestured toward a second chair at her workstation. "You are welcome to observe. I will explain as I work." Mark took a seat and watched as she brought up additional layers of holographic data. The Asolari have long utilized bioengineered microorganisms to stabilize atmospheric conditions on our homeworld. On this station, we are adapting these techniques to address the specific conditions found on Earth-like planets within the Confederation. "That sounds," Mark trailed off, searching for the right word, "incredibly advanced. Do the microorganisms interact directly with the atmospheric particles?" "Yes. They bond at a molecular level, facilitating the breakdown of harmful compounds and promoting the regeneration of stable elements. However, We must account for variations in local flora and fauna to ensure the ecosystem remains balanced. She tilted her head, studying him. Your interest appears genuine. Are you trained in biological sciences? Not exactly, Mark admitted. I'm more of a cultural liaison, meant to help bridge the human and Asolari perspectives. But I've always been fascinated by the intersection of science and diplomacy. When I see something as groundbreaking as this, I can't help but want to understand it better. Filka nodded slowly. Understanding is important. It is the foundation upon which cooperation is built. He smiled. Couldn't agree more. As she continued explaining the finer points of the project, Mark found himself more and more intrigued. Filka's manner of speaking was measured and precise, her tone thoughtful. It was clear she took her work seriously. The holographic diagrams shifted and transformed under her guidance, illustrating complex processes that Mark could only begin to grasp. After a while, another voice interrupted them. "Ah, the new guy," Ryan said, stepping into view. The older man crossed his arms and leaned against the side of the workstation. "I see you've met Filka. Hope she's not overwhelming you with the science talk." "Not at all," Mark said. "Actually, it's pretty fascinating." Filka looked at Ryan, her scales darkening slightly. "I am attempting to provide Mr. Willis with a thorough understanding of our current research. If it is too much—" "Relax," Ryan interrupted with a chuckle. "Mark's a smart guy. He'll keep up. Besides, it's good that he's interested. Makes my job easier." Mark glanced between the two of them. "You mentioned that humans and Asolari have different approaches to research. How so?" Ryan gestured toward the various workstations. "Take humans. We're all about efficiency, deadlines, and deliverables. If we don't hit milestones, we're convinced we're failing. Asolari, on the other hand, they're more about the long game. They'd rather spend years perfecting one technique than rush to put out something half-baked. It's a clash of philosophies, really. That's why people like you and Filka are so important. We need folks who can navigate that gap." "Interesting," Mark said, looking at Filka. "Does that make it difficult to collaborate?" "It can be," she admitted. "However, when we find a balance, the results are often superior. The blending of methodologies, your species' drive to produce and our emphasis on refinement, can yield remarkable outcomes." "Sounds like a challenge worth tackling," Mark said. Ryan laughed. "That's the spirit. Anyway, I'll let you two get back to it. Just remember, Mark, it's not all work around here. Take some time to relax every now and then." "Noted," Mark said with a smile. As Ryan walked away, Mark turned his attention back to Filka. "So, what's the next step in your project?" She glanced at the holographic display. "We must simulate Earth-like conditions within our containment fields and monitor the microorganisms' adaptation. If successful, we can proceed to larger-scale tests." "Any way I can help?" he asked. Filka hesitated, her scales rippling briefly before settling. "If you are comfortable, I could use assistance in calibrating the environmental controls. It requires careful adjustment, and having a second set of hands would be beneficial." Mark nodded. "I'd be happy to help. Just tell me what to do." They spent the next hour fine-tuning the equipment. Filka showed Mark how to adjust the parameters, explaining each step with patience. Though the work was technical, Mark found the collaborative effort rewarding. He asked questions, and she answered, her explanations clear and concise. It was a small but meaningful contribution to the project, and for the first time since arriving on the station, Mark felt like he was truly part of the team. When they finally finished, Filka looked at him, her golden eyes softening. "Thank you," Mark Willis. Your assistance was greatly appreciated. Any time, he said, wiping his hands. It was surprisingly enjoyable. She inclined her head, a faint trace of a smile appearing. Perhaps we can work together again. I'd like that, Mark said, feeling a sense of accomplishment, and perhaps something else, something deeper, beginning to grow. The next week on the station felt like it passed in a blur. Mark quickly settled into a routine. Mornings were spent reviewing cultural data and preparing his reports, while afternoons were often dedicated to working alongside Filka in the research wing. Over time, their interactions shifted from purely professional exchanges to moments of genuine camaraderie. They had begun to rely on each other, not just as colleagues, but as collaborators who brought out the best in one another. On one particular afternoon, Mark was reviewing some atmospheric readings when Filka approached, her movements unusually hesitant. She stopped a few feet away from his station, her green scales shimmering faintly. "Mark Willis," she said softly, "may I have a word with you?" "Sure, what's on your mind?" he asked, setting his data slate aside. He gestured to the stool beside him. "Take a seat." Filka glanced at the stool, but chose to remain standing. "It is about the recent observations you made regarding the molecular integration rates. Your suggestions, while unconventional, seem to be yielding interesting results." "Unconventional?" Mark tilted his head, smiling. "That's a nice way of saying weird, isn't it?" She blinked, her scales darkening slightly. "I meant no offense. Weird is not the word I would use." I know. Mark chuckled. "I'm just teasing you. So, the results are promising, then?" "They are. I have not seen such a rapid stabilization pattern before. It raises questions about whether our previous methods have been too cautious." "Cautious is safe," Mark said. "But sometimes you have to push the boundaries a little." Filka studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. "You are not like most humans I have met. Your approach is different." "Different how?" "You consider possibilities that others dismiss. It is as though you see connections where others see only obstacles." Her scales flickered with a subtle blue hue, which Mark had come to recognize as a sign of thoughtfulness. "I find it intriguing." "Well," Mark said, leaning back in his chair, "I'll take that as a compliment. But I can't take all the credit. It's easy to come up with new ideas when I'm working with someone as brilliant as you." Filka's scales brightened again, this time shifting to a faint pink. She looked away briefly. "You are kind to say so." "I'm just being honest," Mark replied. "Besides, you're the one who's turning those ideas into actual results. That's no small feat." Before Filka could respond, a voice called out from across the lab. "Mark, there you are." It was Ryan, striding in with his usual brisk energy. He carried a container filled with what looked like equipment parts. "Ryan," Mark said, turning to face him. "What's up?" "We've got an issue with one of the environmental control systems," Ryan said, setting the container on a nearby table. "Nothing critical, but it's throwing off some of our readings. I could use another pair of hands. Filka, you're welcome to join us if you've got time." Filka glanced at Mark, then back at Ryan. "I am available." "What is the nature of the malfunction?" "Just a pressure calibration that's gone out of whack," Ryan said. "It shouldn't take long, but it's fiddly work." "Mark, you're good with small adjustments, right?" Mark shrugged. "I can handle it." The three of them headed to the Environmental Control Hub, a compact room filled with intricate panels and displays. Ryan pointed to one of the control nodes, a series of dials and valves that required careful tuning. "Here's the deal," Ryan said. We need to bring the pressure down incrementally. Too fast, and we risk a cascade effect. Too slow, and we'll be here all night. Mark nodded. Got it. Where do you want me? Start with the primary intake valve, Ryan said. I'll handle the secondary controls. Filka, can you monitor the readouts and let us know if we're straying from optimal levels? Understood, Filka said, moving to the nearest console. As they worked, the room filled with the faint sound of hissing air and the soft beeps of the control panel. Mark focused on the valve in front of him, turning it ever so slightly. How's that? He asked, glancing over his shoulder at Filka. Pressure has stabilized, she replied, her tone calm. Continue at that rate. Ryan nodded from the other side of the room. Nice and steady, Mark. You're doing fine. They continued for several minutes, adjusting, checking, and rechecking until the system finally returned to normal. Ryan let out a satisfied grunt. That should do it. Thanks, both of you. Mark wiped his hands on his pants. Any time. It's actually kind of satisfying when things work the way they're supposed to. Ryan grinned. You're starting to sound like a real engineer. Maybe we'll keep you on double duty. Don't get any ideas, Mark said with a laugh. Filka stepped closer, her golden eyes flicking between them. This collaboration was efficient. I appreciate the opportunity to assist. Glad to have you, Ryan said. You've got a steady hand and a sharp eye. That goes for both of you. As they left the control room, Mark walked alongside Filka. Looks like we make a good team, he said. It seems so, she replied, her scales glinting faintly. Perhaps we can continue to work together on future tasks. I'd like that, Mark said, feeling a warm sense of connection growing between them. They reached the main corridor, where Ryan parted ways with a quick wave. Mark and Filka lingered for a moment, the hum of the station surrounding them. Mark Willis, Filka said after a pause. Thank you again for your assistance. Your approach is refreshing. Any time, he said, smiling. And you can just call me Mark. Her lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. Very well, Mark. With that, she turned and headed back to the research wing. Mark watched her go, his thoughts a mixture of curiosity and something he couldn't quite define. It was clear that the longer he stayed on the station, the more unexpected connections he was going to make. The following morning, Mark awoke to the subtle hum of the station's atmosphere filters. Despite the sterile environment, the day held a certain energy, something unspoken in the air. He couldn't quite place it, but the station felt different, as if the mood among its inhabitants had shifted overnight. Mark arrived at the main laboratory to find Ryan leaning against one of the tables, a mug of steaming coffee in hand. The man's usual easy demeanor was replaced by something more thoughtful as he stared at one of the large, curved data panels displaying a rotating holographic model of the local planetary system. Morning, Mark greeted, dropping his data slate onto the counter. What's on your mind? Ryan glanced up, giving a faint smile. Just reviewing the project timelines. We're on track, but barely. Barely is better than falling behind, Mark said, taking a seat across from him. Still, you look like you've been up all night. I wouldn't call it up all night, Ryan replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Let's just say I didn't sleep much. Before Mark could press further, the door slid open to reveal Filka. Her scales glinted a soft green, and she carried a portable console tucked under one arm. She paused just inside the doorway, her eyes flicking between Mark and Ryan. Good morning, she said, her tone reserved but pleasant. Morning, Filka, Mark said. We were just talking about the project timelines. Filka stepped further into the room and placed her console on the table. I have compiled the latest data from the atmospheric regeneration trials. The results are promising, but they reveal certain inconsistencies that must be addressed. Such as? Ryan asked. His interest piqued. Filka tapped the console, and a series of graphs and charts appeared in the air between them. The microorganism's adaptation rate has increased beyond our projections, suggesting an external variable is influencing their development. I suspect environmental factors within the station may be contributing. Ryan frowned. Anomalies inside the station? Any idea what's causing it? Not yet, Filka admitted. But I have prepared a set of diagnostic procedures to identify potential sources. Mark leaned forward, studying the graphs. Could it be something as simple as a minor fluctuation in temperature or humidity? If the microorganisms are that sensitive, even a slight change might have an impact. It is possible, Filka said. That is why I intend to conduct a controlled isolation test. If we can remove the suspected variables, we may confirm whether these fluctuations are responsible. Ryan nodded. Sounds like a good plan. What do you need from us? Filka hesitated for a moment, then glanced at Mark. If you are available, I would appreciate your assistance in setting up the containment units. It requires precise calibration, and I believe your perspective might prove valuable. Sure, Mark said, rolling up his sleeves. Let's get to it. Together, the three of them moved to the environmental testing chamber, a large, sterile room filled with transparent enclosures and control panels. Filka directed Mark toward one of the larger containment units, showing him how to adjust the parameters on the console. Each setting must be configured in sequence, she explained, her voice calm and steady. If you deviate even slightly, the conditions will no longer be suitable for the experiment. Got it, Mark said, carefully following her instructions. Ryan joined them, working on a neighboring unit. He glanced over at Mark and grinned. Looks like you're getting the hang of this science stuff, Mark. You sure you're not a closet engineer? I wouldn't go that far, Mark said with a laugh. But I'm learning. As they worked, Mark couldn't help but notice how Filka's demeanor had changed. The station's dining hall was unusually lively that evening, filled with a mix of human and Asolari voices. Mark had grown accustomed to the blend of languages and tones, but tonight's atmosphere was particularly charged. The biannual cultural exchange night was underway, and the event was an opportunity for both species to showcase their traditions, food, and art. Mark walked into the hall, carrying a tray of human snacks he had prepared earlier with Ryan's help. Ryan followed close behind, balancing a large platter of grilled vegetables and meat skewers. I'm telling you, Mark, Ryan said with a grin, if this doesn't win them over, nothing will. Everyone loves a good barbecue. Let's hope so, Mark replied, setting his tray down on a long table already crowded with dishes from both species. He eyed the vibrant Asolari food, colorful, gelatinous spheres arranged in intricate patterns. Some dishes even seemed to glow faintly under the lights. Though I'm not sure our skewers can compete with whatever that is. Ryan shrugged. They're welcome to try it, but I'll stick to what I know won't move on my plate. As they finished setting up, Mark noticed Filka entering the hall, carrying a small, ornate container. Her scales shimmered with a soft green hue, and her golden eyes scanned the room until they landed on him. She walked over, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Mark," she said with a slight nod. "Ryan, I see you have contributed to the exchange." "Sure have," Ryan said, grinning. "Barbecue skewers, straight from Earth's best traditions. I hope you're hungry." Filka tilted her head. "I will be certain to try them. I have brought a traditional Asolari dish for this occasion." She held up the container, opening it to reveal small, crystalline clusters that seemed to refract the light. They are called Velisk. They are harvested during our annual festivals and are considered a delicacy. They look amazing, Mark said, leaning in for a closer look. What do they taste like? They are sweet, with a subtle tang, Filka explained. Would you like to try one? Mark hesitated for a moment before nodding. Filka picked up one of the clusters and handed it to him. As he bit into it, the flavor burst onto his tongue, a perfect balance of sweetness and a tart finish, unlike anything he had ever tasted. That's incredible, he said, his eyes widening. You weren't kidding about it being a delicacy. Filka's scales shifted to a faint pink. I am pleased that you enjoy it. Ryan, watching the exchange with a smirk, picked up one of the Velisk clusters and popped it into his mouth. Not bad, he admitted, chewing thoughtfully. Still think the skewers are going to steal the show, though. The three of them spent the next hour moving through the hall, sampling dishes and mingling with the crowd. Mark took the opportunity to ask Filka more about the Asolari traditions represented at the event. So, this festival where you harvest Velisk, he said. What's it like? It is a time of celebration and unity, Filka explained. We gather in our communal spaces to honor the growth of the Velisk and to reflect on our connections with one another. Music, dance, and shared meals are central to the festivities. Sounds beautiful, Mark said. Humans have similar traditions. We celebrate harvests too, though it usually involves a lot of food and maybe some questionable dancing. Filka's lips quirked in what Mark recognized as her version of a smile. Perhaps you could demonstrate this questionable dancing sometime. Mark chuckled. Only if you promise not to judge too harshly. As the evening progressed, Mark noticed that Filka seemed more at ease than usual, her usual reserved demeanor giving way to moments of humor and curiosity. At one point, they found themselves standing near the corner of the hall, observing an impromptu performance by a group of Asolari musicians. Their instruments are incredible, Mark said, gesturing toward the delicate, string-like devices that emitted rich, resonant tones. I've never heard anything like it. They are called thillery, Filka said. Each string is attuned to a specific frequency, allowing for a wide range of harmonics. The music is intended to evoke emotion and memory. It's definitely working, Mark said, listening intently. What about you? Do you play? Filka's scales darkened slightly, and she looked away. I have attempted to learn, but my skill is limited. I'm sure that's not true, Mark said. I bet you're better than you think. Perhaps, she said softly, but my focus has always been on science. Music, though beautiful, has always felt beyond my grasp. Maybe you just need a good teacher, Mark said, or someone to practice with. Filka turned to him, her golden eyes meeting his. Would you be willing to try? Mark blinked. Me? I wouldn't even know where to start. Perhaps that is the point, Filka said. We would learn together. Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the suggestion, but the look in her eyes was earnest, and he found himself nodding. All right, I'm in. But no promises. I might be worse than your limited skill. Filka's scales brightened again, and she inclined her head. I accept the risk. Their conversation was interrupted by Ryan, who appeared with 2 plates of food. You two look like you're plotting something, he said, handing a plate to Mark. Anything I should know about? Just planning to start a band, Mark said, taking a bite of one of the skewers. You in? Ryan laughed. Depends. Do I get to be lead singer? We'll see, Mark said with a grin. Filka might have other ideas. As the night wound down, Mark and Filka lingered near the edge of the crowd, watching as the last of the performances wrapped up. The energy in the room had shifted to something quieter, more reflective. Thank you for inviting me to this event, Filka said, her voice low. "It has been meaningful." "Thanks for sharing it with me," Mark replied. "I think we make a pretty good team, whether it's fixing pressure valves or surviving cultural exchange night." Filka tilted her head, her scales shimmering faintly. "I agree. Perhaps this is the beginning of something significant." Mark felt his pulse quicken at her words, but he managed a calm smile. "Maybe it is." Mark had come to find a certain rhythm to life aboard the station. By now, his days often included shared tasks with Filka, sometimes assisting her with environmental adjustments in the lab, other times walking through the atrium discussing cultural practices. Their partnership felt increasingly natural, and though no one on the station commented openly, Mark had caught more than a few curious looks from both humans and Asolari alike. This particular morning, Mark arrived at the greenhouse section of the research wing, where Filka had asked him to help analyze some unusual plant growth. He spotted her near a row of glowing, vine-like plants that clung to a trellis along the curved wall. Her scales shimmered in the soft light, their usual green tinged with gold. She turned as he approached, and the faint pink in her color was becoming familiar. "Mark Willis," she said, her lips curving upward slightly. "You are punctual." "Just call me Mark," he said, smiling as he stepped closer. "And punctuality's the least I can do after all the times you've put up with my questions." She gestured toward the plants, her voice calm but curious. "These Lysaris vines have begun to grow more rapidly than anticipated. I thought you might have a theory about what is happening." "Me?" "You're the scientist here," Mark replied, kneeling down to examine the glowing tendrils. He reached out carefully, letting his fingers hover just above the plant's surface. "What's different about the environment lately? Has anything changed?" Filka tilted her head, the gold in her scales deepening. "The temperature controls have remained stable, as have the nutrient levels. However, there was a slight increase in ambient light last cycle." "Well, that could explain it," Mark said. "More light might be triggering faster growth. Or maybe the vines are responding to a specific wavelength. Could we adjust the light spectrum and see if it slows them down?" Filka's eyes glinted with interest. "A reasonable approach. I had considered nutrient adjustment, but altering the light could yield more immediate results." "I'll leave the technical part to you," Mark said, standing up and dusting off his hands. "You're the expert. I'm just here to ask the dumb questions." "There are no dumb questions," she said, her tone soft. "Your curiosity is one of the qualities I appreciate most." Mark paused, meeting her golden gaze. "Well, thanks for saying that. I appreciate you putting up with all my learning curves." "I do not put up with you," she said, and the faint pink in her scales spread further. "I find your perspective valuable and enjoyable." "Likewise," Mark said, his voice quieter now. The moment lingered between them, the background hum of the greenhouse fading into stillness. Filka stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Mark, there is something I have been curious about." "Sure," he said, swallowing. "What is it?" "Humans often express connection through touch," she began, her voice careful. "I have observed it among the others here. Handshakes, pats on the shoulder, even embraces. Yet, I have never fully understood the meaning. Could you explain it to me?" Mark felt his chest tighten. "Touch? Well, it can mean a lot of things. A handshake, for example, is a greeting, like saying I'm glad to meet you. A pat on the shoulder might be encouragement. And an embrace or a hug, that's usually more personal. It's a way of showing care, affection, or comfort." Filka looked thoughtful, her scales flickering between green and gold. "And what of a touch such as this?" She lifted her hand, her slender fingers hovering just above his. Mark hesitated, his breath catching. That could mean something personal, too. "May I?" she asked softly, her golden eyes meeting his. Mark nodded, his pulse quickening. Filka's fingers brushed against his, a feather-light contact that sent a warm, unfamiliar sensation through him. Her scales shifted again, the faint pink returning. "And this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "does this have a meaning?" "Yes," Mark said quietly, his hand turning to meet hers more fully. "It means we trust each other, that we care." Filka tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Trust and care. These are significant." "They are," Mark said. He glanced down at their hands, still lightly touching. "Sometimes they're everything." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Filka withdrew her hand gently, her scales shimmering brighter. "Thank you, Mark. I believe I understand now." "I'm glad," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "If you ever have more questions, just ask." "I will," she said, her tone softer than usual. She stepped back toward the vines, turning her attention to the work at hand. "Now, shall we proceed with adjusting the light?" "Sure," Mark said, shaking off the momentary daze. He grabbed a tool from the nearby counter. "You lead, I'll follow." As they worked together, adjusting the light settings and monitoring the vines, Mark found himself glancing at Filka more often than he cared to admit. There was something new in their dynamic, something unspoken, but undeniably present. And while Mark wasn't sure exactly what it was, he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want it to fade. Mark spent the next few days turning over recent events in his mind. He and Filka had shared a moment. Brief, yes, but unmistakably significant. The thought of it sent a small thrill through him, yet it also came with a weight he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the station's cultural differences that concerned him, but also the quiet scrutiny he could feel from both humans and Asolari around him. The relationship he was building with Filka didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, Ryan caught up with him in the crew lounge. The older man strolled over with a cup of steaming tea in hand and settled into the chair across from Mark. "You've been keeping busy," Ryan said, taking a sip. "Always running around with Filka these days, huh?" "Yeah, we've been working on a few projects together," Mark replied cautiously, not sure where this was going. Ryan raised an eyebrow, setting his cup down on the table. "Working on projects, sure. But that's not all, is it?" Mark shifted in his seat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you two seem close," Ryan said, his voice calm but his gaze direct. "And not just in a professional sense. Don't get me wrong, Mark. I'm not here to judge. But you know people are talking." "People talk about anything out of the ordinary," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "It doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong." Ryan nodded. "You're not. But you should be prepared for how others might see it. Humans and Asolari. It's still a new relationship, diplomatically speaking. The cultural differences run deep. Not everyone's going to be open-minded." Mark frowned, staring at the table. "Filka and I haven't done anything to deserve scrutiny. We've been working together, getting to know each other. That's it. And that's fine," Ryan said. "But it's also uncharted territory. If this is more than just a friendship, and I'm not saying it is or isn't, then you'll need to be ready to handle the fallout, especially from people who don't get it." Mark thought about that as Ryan stood and patted him on the shoulder. "Just something to consider," Ryan said. "You're a good guy, Mark. Whatever you decide, just be careful, all right?" "Sure," Mark said, though he still felt unsettled as Ryan left. Later that evening, Mark met Filka in the atrium to review data on the environmental restoration project. As they worked side by side, he kept stealing glances at her. She seemed more focused than ever, her golden eyes fixed on the holographic display. Yet, there was a tension in the air that Mark couldn't ignore. "Filka," he began carefully, "have you noticed anything different lately? Between us, I mean." Filka paused, her hand hovering over the console. "Different?" she asked, her voice measured. "In what way?" "I mean how others see us," Mark said, gesturing around. "I've gotten the feeling that people, both humans and Asolari, are paying more attention to what we're doing." Filka tilted her head, her scales shifting slightly. "I have observed some increased curiosity. It is not unexpected. Our collaboration has been productive, and productive partnerships often attract attention." Mark hesitated. "But it's more than just curiosity, isn't it? People seem to think there's something else going on." Filka's scales flickered briefly. "And if there were, would that be concerning?" He studied her expression, trying to read the subtle emotions that played across her features. "Not for me," he said finally. "But it might be for others." "Others may hold their opinions," Filka said, her voice calm. "It does not change the reality of our work, or the truth of our interactions." Mark felt a surge of gratitude for her straightforwardness. "So you're saying we just keep doing what we're doing?" She turned to face him, her eyes steady. "I am saying that your companionship is meaningful to me. If others do not understand that, it is their concern, not ours." Mark nodded slowly. "I feel the same way. I just didn't want to make things harder for you." Filka's lips curved into a faint smile. "You have not made anything harder. On the contrary, you have made my time on this station brighter." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Before he could respond, a voice called out from behind them. "Mark, Filka," a technician said as he approached, holding a data pad. "We've got a situation in the nutrient regulation system. I could use your expertise." Mark exchanged a glance with Filka. "Looks like work calls." "Indeed," she said, her tone light. "Let us go." They followed the technician to the agricultural section, where a malfunction had caused some of the crops to grow unevenly. Mark and Filka quickly fell into their usual rhythm, troubleshooting the issue together. Their conversation shifted to problem-solving, their hands working in tandem as they adjusted controls and reset parameters. At one point, as Mark handed Filka a diagnostic tool, their fingers brushed. It was a small, fleeting contact, but it sent a familiar warmth through him. She glanced at him briefly, her scales tinged pink, but said nothing. They continued their work, side by side, until the system stabilized. Once the issue was resolved, the technician thanked them and left, leaving Mark and Filka alone in the quiet room. Mark leaned against the counter, watching her as she secured the tools they'd used. "Filka," he said after a moment, "I'm glad we're in this together." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "I am as well, Mark. And I am certain we can face whatever challenges may come." Her words were simple, but they carried a depth that left him feeling more certain than ever that their connection, whatever it was worth protecting. The atmosphere on the station shifted over the next few weeks. Mark noticed it not only in the lingering glances from his human colleagues or the subtle changes in the Asolari's posture, but in the quiet, unspoken tension that seemed to fill the halls. While no one openly commented on his relationship with Filka, it was clear that more than a few had formed their own opinions. Mark wasn't sure what bothered him more, the subtle disapproval from some humans or the intrigued, sometimes confused reactions from the Asolari. One morning, as Mark sat in the station's lounge with Ryan, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee, The older man leaned in slightly. "You seem on edge," Ryan said, his voice low. Mark glanced around before replying. "People are watching. I can feel it." Ryan nodded slowly. "They are. That's just how it is here. Humans and Asolari, working together, sharing space. Every little thing gets magnified. It's not just about work," Mark said. "They're watching because of me and Filka." Ryan raised an eyebrow. And it's getting to me," Mark admitted. "I don't want her to feel uncomfortable, like she's under a microscope." Ryan sat back, considering his words. "Have you talked to her about it?" "Not directly," Mark said. "I don't want to make it worse." Ryan let out a low chuckle. "Listen, you're in uncharted territory. You've got to be honest with her. She's smart, Mark. She's probably picked up on all this too." Mark sighed. "You're probably right. I'll bring it up." Later that day, Mark joined Filka in the atrium. She was seated at a curved bench near one of the large observation windows, reviewing data on her console. The light from the binary stars cast a warm glow over her scales, which shimmered faintly green. "Filka," Mark said as he approached, "do you have a moment?" She looked up, her golden eyes meeting his. "Of course. What is it?" Mark hesitated before sitting down beside her. "Have you noticed the way people are acting? The way they're watching us?" Filka tilted her head slightly, her scales shifting toward a faint blue. "I have noticed an increase in attention. It seems our cooperation has drawn curiosity." "Curiosity," Mark said, giving a small laugh. "That's a polite way to put it." She regarded him carefully. "Are you concerned?" "I'm concerned about you," Mark admitted. "I don't want you to feel uncomfortable because of how others are reacting." Filka paused, her gaze steady. "Mark, the opinions of others do not change what is important to me. Your companionship and the work we do together have meaning. That does not diminish because someone else does not understand." Her words struck him deeply. "Still, I feel like I've put you in a difficult position." "You have done nothing wrong," Filka said firmly. "What we share is not a burden. It is a choice, one I am willing to make." Mark nodded slowly. "I just want to be sure you're okay with everything." "I am," she said simply. The tension in Mark's chest eased slightly. "Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it." Filka's scales shifted to a warm gold. "You are welcome." Their conversation was interrupted by a station-wide alert. A soft chime echoed through the atrium, followed by a calm, automated voice announcing a minor atmospheric breach in one of the storage bays. Mark and Filka exchanged a glance before rising to their feet. "Shall we investigate?" Filka asked. "Sure," Mark said. "Let's go." They made their way to the storage bay, where a small team of engineers was already at work sealing the breach. The damage was minor, a hairline crack in one of the pressure panels. Mark joined the team, helping to steady a piece of equipment as the engineers made the repairs. Filka stood nearby, monitoring the atmospheric readings on her console. "Pressure is stabilizing," she reported. One of the engineers glanced at her. "Good to hear. We'll have this wrapped up in no time." The work went quickly, and soon the team declared the bay secure. As the engineers left to file their report, Mark and Filka lingered a moment longer. "Another day, another adventure," Mark said, smiling faintly. "Indeed," Filka said. "And yet, each day feels significant." Mark looked at her, noting the thoughtful expression on her face. "What do you mean?" Filka hesitated before answering. "Since meeting you, I have come to understand more about human perspective. Your way of approaching challenges, your willingness to connect on a personal level. It has changed the way I view collaboration. Mark felt a warmth spread through him. You've changed my perspective too. You've taught me that patience and understanding can build bridges no one thought possible. Filka tilted her head slightly. We have taught each other, then. Sounds about right, Mark said with a grin. They made their way back to the main corridor, the hum of the station returning to its usual rhythm. As they walked side by side, Mark realized that the judgment of others mattered less than he thought. What truly mattered was the bond they were building, something neither human nor Asolari tradition had fully prepared them for, but something real and worth holding on to. The station hummed with a steady, comforting rhythm, but the past few weeks had brought a subtle change to that constant. Where Mark once felt like a newcomer navigating an unfamiliar environment, he now walked the halls with a sense of belonging, largely due to the connection he had built with Filka. Their relationship had grown from a professional partnership to something deeper, though neither of them had put it into words. That morning, Mark found himself in the research wing, reviewing data from the recent atmospheric tests. Filka was nearby, her attention focused on a set of environmental readouts. The silence between them was comfortable, marked only by the quiet beeping of instruments and the occasional sound of footsteps from other researchers. "Mark," Filka said after a moment, not looking up from her console, "I have been considering the results of our latest simulation. The microorganisms responded more quickly than anticipated." Mark turned in his chair to face her. "That's a good thing, right?" "It is," she replied, finally lifting her golden eyes to meet his. "However, it also suggests that we may need to adjust our parameters to maintain long-term stability." "What do you recommend?" he asked, leaning forward. "An incremental reduction in the nutrient supply, paired with a slight increase in ultraviolet exposure," she said. "It would allow us to observe how the microorganisms adapt under controlled stress conditions." "Sounds reasonable," Mark said. "And you're the expert on this stuff. I trust your judgment." Filka's scales shimmered faintly pink. "You often express trust in me, Mark. It is reassuring." "Well," he said, smiling, "you've more than earned it. Besides, we're a team. I couldn't do this without you." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I feel the same. Your perspective and support have been invaluable." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He was about to respond when Ryan entered the lab, his presence breaking the quiet atmosphere. "Hey, you two," Ryan said, grinning. "Looks like you've been busy. Anything new on the microbial front?" "Just fine-tuning some of the variables," Mark said, standing to stretch his legs. "Filka's got a plan to keep everything stable long-term." "Of course she does," Ryan said, nodding at her. "You've got a knack for solving problems, Filka." Filka inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Ryan." Ryan turned his attention back to Mark. "You should come by the lounge later. A few of us are having a game night, and I don't think I've seen you relax since you got here." Mark laughed. "Maybe I will. What are you playing?" "Cards, mostly. And maybe a round or two of that holographic strategy game the Asolari taught us. You should try it." "I'll think about it," Mark said. He glanced at Filka. "What about you? You should come too." Filka looked surprised. "I have not participated in such activities before." "Well, there's a first time for everything," Mark said. "It's just for fun." Ryan clapped him on the shoulder. "Exactly. No pressure, just some good company. Think about it." After Ryan left, Mark turned back to Filka. "What do you think? Want to join me?" She considered for a moment before giving a small nod. "If you will be there, I will attend." "Great," Mark said, smiling. It'll be nice to do something different. That evening, the lounge was lively with the sound of laughter and conversation. Mark and Filka arrived together, drawing a few curious looks but no comments. Ryan waved them over to a table where a small group was already dealing out cards. "Glad you made it," Ryan said, pulling out 2 chairs. "Filka, you know how to play?" "No," she admitted. "But I am willing to learn." Ryan chuckled. "That's all it takes. Mark can show you the ropes." Mark sat beside her and quickly explained the rules. Filka listened intently, her golden eyes focused on the cards as he described the goal of the game and the strategies involved. When it was her turn, she picked up the mechanics quickly, surprising everyone with her sharp mind and ability to adapt. By the end of the first round, Filka had already won twice. The group laughed and teased each other, and even Filka allowed herself a small smile at the playful banter. Mark watched her, impressed by how easily she fit into the group, despite her initial reservations. When the games wound down, Mark and Filka lingered in the lounge, sipping drinks and talking quietly while the others cleaned up. "You were great tonight," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "I think Ryan's still trying to figure out how you beat him so many times." Filka's scales shimmered faintly pink. "It was enjoyable. I am grateful you invited me." "You're welcome any time," he said. "I like having you there." Filka regarded him for a moment, her expression softening. "Mark, I must tell you. This time on the station has been transformative for me. Meeting you has changed how I see humans, how I see collaboration." He felt his chest tighten at her words. "Filka, I feel the same way. You've taught me so much, about science, culture, and even myself." She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. It was a brief touch, but it carried a weight that neither of them could deny. Her golden eyes met his, and for a moment the noise of the lounge faded into the background. "I believe," Filka said softly, "that we have found something rare and meaningful." Mark nodded, his voice quiet but sure. "I think so too."